Okay, hello, I'm Kelvin, and I'm going to talk about my experience of using VS Code as my main IDE, which is something I've been doing for the sort of best part of a year now. But before I get into that, just a bit about me. So I've been in the industry about 10 years. I started off as an apprentice .NET developer, which meant that I worked exclusively with Visual Studio. But over that 10 years, I've moved more towards web development, which has included TypeScript and JavaScript, and more recently with VS Code included. And these were the two tools that I used almost exclusively up until quite recently. I used Visual Studio for the .NET stuff, and VS Code for the more TypeScript and JavaScript side of things. But around 9 months ago, I was being put on a project, and I decided that when I went onto this project, which was ASP.NET and TypeScript, so ordinarily it would have been those two tools, I decided to get rid of Visual Studio and just go VS Code and just go full hog and go into it. And there's a few different reasons why I wanted to do this. So the first thing is I was getting a little frustrated with just the plethora of windows that I had open in front of me, and particularly, I mean, it sounds a bit silly, but just when I was trying to do code, sometimes it was just that mental thing to go, which window am I meant to be in? And it just slowed me down. It got even worse when I was trying to debug, because C# was fine. I could just hop into Visual Studio. I was already writing code there, put a breakpoint in, I'd hit it. But in VS Code, where I was writing the TypeScript, I couldn't just put a breakpoint there. I had to go over to my browser window, open up DevTools, find that same file I was just in, put a breakpoint in. And then C# files as well, which I was occasionally looking at in VS Code, I had the same problem. I had to go across into another window, press a button, and find where it was. I was also aware that VS Code supported a lot of languages, and one day I probably wanted to learn one of these languages, or one of the languages that an extension gave VS Code. And I didn't want to have to learn a whole new IDE when I got to that point as well. I just wanted to go in there and learn a language. And if I was comfortable with the IDE, that'd be awesome. I'd just learn the language. But the final thing that really pushed me over the edge and made me go, yes, I'm going to do this, is dev containers, or what powers GitHub code spaces. And I'm not going to talk about these. There's a whole other talk in there somewhere for this. Someone could do this one day, please. I don't want to do it. But I was getting really excited about these. There was podcasts, there was chats with colleagues, blogs that I'd read about, and I just wanted to learn. But whenever I'd tried, I'd really struggled because I realized I wasn't comfortable in VS Code. I was just using it in such a small place that I just wasn't comfortable. So, like I said, I was being put on this project for just a few weeks, about 9 months ago, to help out, keep velocity up while someone was off sick. And I thought, this is the opportunity to do it. I'm just going to use VS Code while I'm on this project. So what did I learn? Well, the first thing I learned is that it's really hard. I felt like this guy quite a lot reading the VS Code docs. They're really good, the docs, don't get me wrong. They're trying to describe something that's just complicated in places. And I had to be very persevering and patient with myself to learn it all. The other thing I learned is that VS Code's often just a nice wrapper around a command tool, a command prompt, a terminal window. And you can probably say this for all IDEs, really. After all, Visual Studio is just running msbuild.exe under the hood. But I found with VS Code, it was a lot more obvious to me. It was a lot more in your face, and you had to be a lot more aware of it. And so I learned how to use the terminal a lot more. I thought I was fairly confident before. I'm even more confident now. But the final thing I really learned was how powerful VS Code was. I was pretty aware of how powerful it could be. And it was only when I really used it in anger that I learned how powerful it was. And one of the things that I really found powerful about it was I was on this project just for a few weeks. Because I was just going in, doing some code to keep velocity up, and then leaving again, I didn't need to worry too much about how to get the project set up, or at least I didn't want to. I just wanted to go in there, do some code, leave. And but as I was doing this, I was having to set up VS Code and get get all of the buttons working and wired up to the project. And if that had been done first, as it is now, that I've done it, I could have just gone in there, clicked some buttons, not worried about how things are all hanging together too much, code and leave. And the same applies to junior devs who might be overwhelmed by everything that they're trying to learn at once. They just want to go in there and start coding. And if they had been using VS Code or the project had been set up to use VS Code, that might have been useful. So going back to the things that I wanted to solve originally, the whole multi-Windows things, I was really happy here. I did achieve what I set out to do. I got rid of Visual Studio. When I was using Visual Studio and VS Code, I often had a terminal window open as well, just for like watches and stuff like that. And because I was in VS Code suddenly, I found myself using the terminal, the integrated in, just all the time. Whereas before I didn't really do it, I guess probably because I was just used to alt-tabbing between things, and suddenly that wasn't the natural thing to do anymore. And once I was in the terminal in VS Code just naturally, I was getting all the great things you get from that, because the terminal was showing me errors in my code and hyperlinking straight up to the text editor above. Whereas before, I'd see an error and have to go across and find the file and find where the error was, find the line number, all that kind of stuff. On the subject of debugging, I felt a bit like this chap. I wasn't, it was a bit of, yeah, it wasn't great in the end. So debugging C# was fine. I didn't really find any difference to Visual Studio. And the TypeScript was okay. I got it working. But in order to debug the TypeScript in a browser, VS Code launches the browser in a sandbox kind of automated mode, which means it opens it up as a separate window to the browser window you already had open to browse the web. So I found myself trading multiple Visual Studio and VS windows for multiple Chrome windows, which kind of defeated the point that I was trying to solve originally. On the subject of languages and dev containers, so I haven't had to learn any languages, but I do feel a lot more comfortable in VS Code, so that I know that one day when I do try and learn one of those languages, it should be a much easier thing, because I'll just have to learn the language, not the IDE. That's been proved in dev containers because I have used them over the last few months, and learning them was so easy once I knew how to use VS Code just naturally. And I didn't have to think about all that stuff. I just was learning the one thing I wanted to learn. But the main question is here, would I do this again? Would I continue to do this? And do I recommend it to all of you? Or am I going to go back to using a mix of the two? And I thought this would be a really, really easy question when I posed this question to me a few days ago, because I've loved using VS Code as my main IDE. I've learned so much. I feel I'm a much better developer because of it. But I also, when I thought about it, I thought, I've missed Visual Studio a little bit. I've seen other people using it, and I've realized that I would like to go back to it. And there's features there that when I think about, there were things in VS Code that I couldn't do as well. And because I was so tunnel-minded on going, no, I'm going to use VS Code as my main IDE, I've got to stick at it, I didn't go to Visual Studio. But when I think back, they would have been better if I'd have just flicked across for certain tasks. So as a closing statement, Visual Studio is a really good Swiss Army knife. And I wholeheartedly recommend that everyone gives it a go at using it as their main IDE. You're going to feel like that chap with all the books at times, and I share your pain, but please persevere. You will become a better developer through the experience. But equally, don't forget about everything else that's in your toolbox.